his car over for expired tag. Just left from
the
a
19th, someone triggering tragedy in the parking lot.
Keyshawn Richards opened fire yesterday morning.
The mother shot nearly a dozen
Man
times.
and woman, they were both shot.
He went into the bedroom, kicked his 10-year-old son in the head, and started shooting.
That's what we know right now about them. The only detail.
A family member of the victim who did not want.
Right now, we will update everyone as soon as we know who later died. Richards made his first appearance.
Hello there. Welcome to the Truly Criminal Network. We are excited to have you here.
Was it self-defense or murder? Mother of four, Quenisha Johnson, claims that self-defense is the reason that she shot her boyfriend, DeMonte Smith, to death last November following a domestic dispute. Police responded to her 911 calls, but the shooting happened after they left her house. Joining us now, Court TV legal correspondent Julia J. outside.
Ted, this jury is engrossed. They are leaning in, trying so hard to hear some of those hard-to-hear moments on the body camera. You can hear some of what these parties are saying during that body camera being played, but there are moments when the sound kind of drops. You can't.
Panic alarm. Let her know that's not a thing.
Well, you disappearing all that lying ass thing shit. You gonna get mad because I react.
He don't live here. He don't pay no bills. His name not on the lease. He don't have no mail. There's nothing here that's his. Besides a trash bag full of clothes that he got from DeKalb County Jail. You can take that and he can go.
Watch out, bro.
You might do that.
Watch out.
Please, please.
I don't want
Come here, man.
Everything hurt, bro.
Oh, yeah. Did she shoot you?
Yeah, before I die.
All right, lay down. Sit down here.
She hit me in the head with a metal thing and then shot me. Those were the final words of 29-year-old DeMonte Smith, captured forever on police body camera footage as he staggered out of a Lithonia, Georgia home on November 27, 2022. Blood soaking through his shirt, he locked eyes with the officers standing in the yard. The same officers who had been there just minutes before the violence erupted. From inside the house, the 911 dispatcher could hear Quenisha Johnson's voice, cold and dismissive. Bye. Not a cry of fear, not a plea for help. Just bye, as if she were ending a phone call rather than a human life. This wasn't a crime that happened in secret. This wasn't violence that occurred before help could arrive. This was a killing that took place with law enforcement officers already on the property, standing mere feet away as a mother of three executed her boyfriend with her own children in the home. How is this possible? How could a man die with police already at the scene? The morning had already been tense when officers responded to Johnson's call for an escort to her home. She claimed she feared Smith after returning late from a night out where she'd left him caring for her children. The officers arrived, spoke with both parties, and even instructed Johnson to secure her firearm in her vehicle. Then they made a decision that would prove fatal. They allowed both Johnson and Smith to enter the home together. What happened in those next few minutes would reveal a disturbing truth about domestic violence, police procedure, and the gap between seeking protection and actually receiving it. Body camera footage, 901 recordings, and court testimony would later reveal that within moments of re-entering the house, Johnson retrieved not only her gun, but also a metal tire iron from her car. She struck Smith in the head before shooting him, all while officers remained outside, unaware of the violence unfolding just beyond the front door. Perhaps most disturbing, Johnson instructed her 8-year-old daughter to call 911 and falsely report that Smith had hit her mother, creating an alternate narrative even as she prepared to commit violence herself. The events of that November morning raise uncomfortable questions. Why weren't the officers more vigilant after responding to a domestic dispute call? How could they miss the retrieval of weapons from the car? And most importantly, how did a situation apparently under control deteriorate so quickly into deadly violence? This case exposes the catastrophic consequences when systems designed to protect fail at their most critical moment. It forces us to examine what happens when calls for help receive inadequate responses, when threats aren't taken seriously enough, and when protocols break down. For DeMonte Smith, these failures cost him everything. For Quenisha Johnson, They led to a 20-year sentence, and for 3 children, they created trauma that will last a lifetime. If you're finding this story as unsettling as we did, make sure you subscribe to Truly Criminal Network. We investigate cases that expose the fractures in our justice system, bringing you the raw facts that other channels won't touch. Hit that subscribe button now, because we're just getting started. Tonight, we piece together how a domestic situation escalated to homicide with law enforcement just steps away. We'll examine the troubled relationship that led to that fatal morning, the evidence that challenged Johnson's claims of self-defense, and the contentious trial that divided a community. This is Police Present, Justice Absent, the devastating story of DeMonte Smith's final moments and the system that failed to prevent them. Before the fatal confrontation that November morning, DeMonte Smith and Quenisha Johnson's lives had already intersected in complex and volatile ways. Their relationship would eventually culminate in violence. But understanding who they were provides essential context for the tragedy that unfolded. DeMonte Smith was 29 years old at the time of his death. Court records reveal he had recently been released from incarceration and was residing with Johnson in Lithonia, Georgia. Despite his legal troubles, Smith had taken on significant responsibilities within the household. On the night before the shooting, he was the primary caregiver for Johnson's 3 children, while she went out with friends, a role he had assumed during various points in their relationship. Those who knew Smith personally described him as more than just the subject of police reports and court documents. Family members emphasized that while he struggled with behavioral issues, he also showed genuine concern for those in his circle. His efforts to locate Johnson during her prolonged absence on the night before his death, repeatedly calling her and reaching out to her family members, revealed both his protective instincts and mounting frustration. Smith's legal history included prior charges of aggravated stalking and battery, facts that would later influence public perception of the case. However, court testimony from those close to him painted a more nuanced portrait of a father trying to support his family despite his flaws and transitions. Quenisha Nicole Johnson was 30 years old at the time of the incident. As a mother of 3 children in Lithonia, Georgia, she maintained the household where the confrontation would ultimately take place. Documentation shows her relationship with Smith was marked by recurring tension and escalating disputes. Johnson's interactions with local authorities weren't new. Records indicate multiple instances where she had contacted police about domestic situations. On the morning of the shooting, her decision to request police escort to her own home demonstrated her apparent fear of Smith's reaction to her late return. The dynamic between Johnson and Smith followed patterns documented in many domestic disputes. Their relationship fluctuated between periods of cooperation, such as Smith caring for Johnson's children, and episodes of conflict that sometimes required outside intervention. Police reports show that Smith's previous convictions for domestic violence had established a documented history of volatile behavior. This background later became central to Johnson's self-defense claims. Yet, investigation records also revealed that despite Johnson's stated fear, she later admitted during questioning that Smith had not physically assaulted her on the day of the incident, a critical detail that undermined portions of her legal defense. Law enforcement had responded to their address multiple times. Each call represented an opportunity for intervention in what was clearly a deteriorating situation. However, like many domestic cases, these interventions provided only temporary de-escalation rather than lasting resolution. The morning of November 27 wasn't the first time Johnson had sought police protection from Smith. Her pattern of calling 911 during disputes indicated both ongoing conflict and her attempts to utilize official channels for safety. Yet the system's response proved inadequate in preventing the ultimate tragedy. He was more than just what happened that day, insisted one family member during court proceedings. Those who knew Smith emphasized that his identity extended beyond his legal troubles and the circumstances of his death. He was described as someone who, despite personal struggles, maintained meaningful connections with his children and family. Meanwhile, Johnson's defenders pointed to the precarious nature of her living situation, suggesting that her actions, while extreme, came after repeated attempts to secure protection through official channels that had failed her. Her calls to 911 and requests for police intervention painted a picture of someone seeking help within a system that offered insufficient solutions. Both individuals were caught in circumstances that reflected broader societal issues: reintegration after incarceration, domestic violence intervention, and the limits of protective services. Their personal histories converged in a relationship that records describe as fraught with challenges from the beginning. The turbulence between them reached a critical point during the late-night hours of November 26th into the morning of November 27. As Smith waited at home with the children, Johnson's extended absence triggered a sequence of events that would irreversibly alter both their fates. What makes this case particularly devastating is that both individuals had previously sought help in their own ways. Smith had reached out to Johnson's family when concerned about her whereabouts. Johnson had contacted authorities when feeling threatened. Yet these attempts at finding outside assistance ultimately culminated in a confrontation that neither the relationship's history nor the authorities' presence managed to prevent. As dawn broke on November 27, 2022, the stage was set for a confrontation that would expose not just the fractures in their relationship, but the gaps in a system designed to protect people in precisely such volatile situations. On November 26, 2022, what began as a routine evening in Lithonia, Georgia, would set in motion a chain of events ending in tragedy. Quenisha Johnson went out with friends, leaving her 3 children at home under DeMonte Smith's care. According to household arrangements documented in police reports, Smith took on the responsibility of looking after the children, while Johnson enjoyed her night out. The evening progressed without incident until the expected return time came and passed. Smith, by all accounts from the investigation, anticipated Johnson would be home by early morning, a reasonable expectation given the responsibilities of caring for 3 young children. But as the hours ticked by, Johnson did not return. Court documents reveal a timeline of mounting concern. Smith began calling Johnson's phone repeatedly as the night stretched on. These calls went unanswered, not because Johnson was ignoring them, but because her phone had been switched off during these hours. The silence on the other end only intensified the tension building at the residence. As dawn approached with still no sign of Johnson, Smith's attempts to locate her escalated. Phone records presented during the trial showed multiple outgoing calls not just to Johnson, but to members of her family as well. These calls, according to testimony, represented Smith's efforts to determine Johnson's whereabouts and when she might return home. Family members later testified that Smith expressed both concern and frustration during these communications, emotions that would fuel the confrontation to come. The prosecution would later point to these calls as evidence of Smith's mounting agitation, while the defense characterized them as the natural concerns of someone left responsible for children who weren't his own. Around 9 a.m. on November 27th, Johnson reactivated her phone. Records from her device showed she immediately discovered the missed communications, not just from Smith but from her own family members whom he had contacted during his search for her. What followed was a critical turning point in the escalating situation. Johnson and Smith engaged in a telephone conversation that, according to court testimony, quickly became heated. Phone records and witness statements presented at trial indicated that during this call, Smith allegedly made verbal threats regarding physical violence should Johnson return late. These threats would later form a cornerstone of Johnson's self-defense claim. Alarmed by what she described as threatening language, Johnson made a decision that brought law enforcement into the equation. She dialed 911, requesting a police escort to her residence. The call, later played in court, captured Johnson explaining her fear of returning home alone to face Smith after their confrontational phone exchange. "I need an escort to my house," Johnson was heard saying on the recording. "He's threatening me and I don't feel safe going back alone." Police dispatch records show officers were promptly assigned to meet Johnson. They arrived at the location in Lithonia and encountered both parties, Johnson outside the home and Smith inside with the children. Body camera footage presented during the trial documented these initial interactions, showing officers attempting to mediate what they recognized as a volatile domestic situation. The responding officers, following standard protocol for domestic disputes, separated Johnson and Smith for initial questioning. During this time, Johnson informed officers about her firearm. Following procedure, the officers instructed Johnson to secure the weapon in her vehicle, a precautionary measure intended to prevent escalation. After speaking with both parties and believing they had sufficiently diffused the immediate tension, the officers made a critical decision. Despite the evident hostility between Johnson and Smith, despite the threats that had prompted the call for police assistance in the first place, the officers allowed both individuals to enter the house together. This decision, allowing two people in open conflict to return to a private space after one had explicitly expressed fear of violence, would prove catastrophic. It represented a pivotal moment when professional intervention had the opportunity to prevent tragedy, but failed to recognize the severity of the risk. Body camera footage shows the officers remaining outside, considering their presence no longer necessary now that the situation appeared under control. They had no way of knowing that within minutes, their decision would set the stage for the violent confrontation they had been called to prevent. Before we reveal what happened inside that house, take a second to hit the subscribe button and notification bell. Our channel brings you exclusive analysis of cases where the justice system fails at critical moments. Subscribers get early access to our in-depth investigative timelines for every case we cover. You won't want to miss what's coming next. What transpired in the moments after both parties re-entered the house would shock even veteran investigators. The police presence, meant to ensure safety, instead became witness to a tragedy they failed to prevent. As Johnson and Smith disappeared inside the doorway, the countdown to violence had begun. The officers remained in the yard, unaware that Johnson was about to retrieve not one, but two weapons from her car. Actions that would fundamentally transform a domestic dispute into something far more permanent. Their decision to allow both parties into the house together represented not just a tactical error, but a fundamental misreading of the volatility between Johnson and Smith. As the front door closed behind them, the final chapter of their troubled relationship was about to unfold, one that would end with Smith's dying words captured on camera and Johnson's voice coldly saying bye as his life slipped away.
Come here, man. Everything hurts, bro. Oh, yeah. Did she shoot you? Yeah, before I die. All right, lay down. Sit down here. Where's it at?
With both Johnson and Smith now inside the residence, the sequence of events accelerated toward violence. Court records reveal that immediately after re-entering the house, Johnson made two decisions that prosecutors would later present as evidence of premeditation rather than self-defense. First, despite having just been instructed by officers to secure her firearm in her vehicle, Johnson returned to her car. Surveillance footage and officer testimony confirmed she retrieved not only the handgun, but also a metal tire iron. The deliberate acquisition of two separate weapons, one blunt, one lethal, became a focal point of the prosecution's case against claims of spontaneous self-defense. Second, and perhaps most revealing of her mindset, Johnson instructed one of her children, her 8-year-old daughter, to call 911 and report that Smith had injured Johnson.
911, what's the address of the emergency? My mom just hit a woman and I feel like I'm a gangster. What's the address? 796 Indian Lane. Okay, do you know the phone number you're calling from?
This directive, captured in the 911 recording and later corroborated by the child's testimony, occurred before any physical altercation had taken place. The prosecution argued this represented an attempt to create an alternative narrative preemptively. "Mommy told me to call and say he hit her," the child later testified, a statement that significantly undermined Johnson's claim of acting in immediate danger. Inside the house, armed with both weapons, Johnson confronted Smith. According to forensic evidence presented at trial, she first struck him in the head with the metal tire iron, a blow substantial enough to cause significant trauma. Immediately following this initial assault, she shot Smith with the handgun she had retrieved from the vehicle. Throughout this violent escalation, the 911 line remained open, capturing audio of the confrontation. The recording, played during court proceedings, captured Johnson repeatedly saying, "Bye," to Smith after firing the gun, statements prosecutors characterized as displaying casualness rather than fear or panic following an act of self-defense. The officers who had remained outside, believing they had successfully de-escalated the situation, suddenly heard the gunshot from within the residence. Body camera footage showed their immediate reaction, weapons drawn, approaching the house with caution, calling for additional units. Moments later, Smith managed to exit the home under his own power despite his injuries. Blood visibly soaking through his clothing, he staggered toward the officers who had been standing in the yard just minutes before. It was at this moment that Smith made his dying declaration, a statement considered especially reliable in legal proceedings because it came from someone aware of their impending death. Looking directly at the officers, Smith stated clearly, "She hit me in the head with a metal thing and then shot me." These words, captured on body camera footage, would become central to the case against Johnson. Emergency medical services arrived promptly after officers radioed in the shooting. Paramedics attempted life-saving measures at the scene before transporting Smith to a nearby hospital. Despite medical intervention, Smith succumbed to his injuries. As medical personnel worked to save Smith, investigators secured the scene. They collected key evidence, including the tire iron and firearm used in the assault. Forensic teams documented blood patterns throughout the house and gathered DNA samples that would later confirm the sequence of events described by Smith before his death. During initial questioning, Johnson maintained she had acted in self-defense, fearing for her safety after Smith's earlier threats. However, investigators quickly identified inconsistencies in her account. Most significantly, despite claiming she feared imminent harm from Smith, Johnson admitted under questioning that Smith had not physically assaulted her on the day of the incident. This critical contradiction, coupled with evidence that she had instructed her child to make a false report and had retrieved weapons from her vehicle after police had separated them, severely undermined her self-defense narrative. The prosecution built their case around several key elements that suggested premeditation rather than a spontaneous response to danger. First, Johnson's deliberate retrieval of both a tire iron and a gun from her car after police had already intervened suggested planning rather than panic. Second, her instruction to her child to report an assault that hadn't occurred indicated an attempt to construct justification before any confrontation happened. Third, the sequence of the attack, first striking Smith with the tire iron, then shooting him, aligned with Smith's dying declaration rather than Johnson's initial account. Finally, the audio recording capturing Johnson saying "bye" multiple times after the shooting presented a demeanor inconsistent with someone who had just been forced to defend themselves from imminent danger. The forensic evidence told a clear story. Blood spatter patterns confirmed Smith was first struck with the blunt object before being shot, exactly as he had described in his final moments. The medical examiner's report detailed the head trauma from the tire iron and the gunshot wound, confirming the dual weapon assault. As detectives compiled witness statements, physical evidence, and audio recordings, the case against Johnson strengthened. What began as a response to a domestic dispute call had transformed into a homicide investigation. One where the victim's own words, captured by the very officers who had failed to protect him, would prove decisive in pursuing justice. When Quanisha Johnson's case reached the courtroom, prosecutors presented a multi-count indictment that reflected the severity and complexity of the incident. Johnson faced charges of malice murder, voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault with specifications of family violence, third-degree cruelty to children, and possession of a firearm during the commission of a felony. The trial spotlighted two competing narratives about what transpired on that November morning. The prosecution methodically constructed their case around physical evidence that contradicted Johnson's initial claims. Central to their presentation was the body camera footage capturing Smith's final statement. "She hit me in the head with a metal thing and then shot me." This dying declaration carried significant weight in court, as legal precedent treats such statements as particularly reliable evidence. Forensic experts testified about blood pattern analysis showing consistency with Smith's account of being struck with the tire iron before being shot. The medical examiner presented detailed findings about the head trauma and gunshot wound, confirming the dual nature of the assault. These technical presentations provided jurors with scientific corroboration of the prosecution's timeline. The 911 recordings played in court revealed two critical elements: Johnson instructing her child to report false information, and her repeated "bye" statements after the shooting. Prosecutors argued these audio elements demonstrated calculation rather than fear, suggesting Johnson was creating an alternative narrative even before violence occurred. Johnson's defense team constructed their argument around the broader context of domestic abuse and fear. They highlighted Johnson's previous calls to 911, seeking protection from Smith's alleged aggression. Her attorney emphasized that Johnson had explicitly requested police escort that morning, precisely because she felt threatened, portraying her actions as the culmination of ongoing fear rather than premeditated violence. This case represents the tragedy that unfolds when victims of domestic violence aren't adequately protected, the defense attorney argued, pointing to Johnson's history of seeking intervention during disputes with Smith. However, this defense strategy faced a significant challenge. Johnson's own admission during police questioning that Smith had not physically assaulted her on the day of the incident. This contradiction undermined the immediate threat component necessary for a successful self-defense claim. Perhaps the most impactful testimony came from Johnson's 8-year-old daughter, who was present during the incident. The child told the court that her mother had instructed her to call 911 and falsely report that Smith had hit Johnson, a statement made before any physical confrontation had occurred. For many jurors, this young witness's account proved decisive in understanding Johnson's mindset. Prosecutors systematically addressed each element of Johnson's self-defense claim. They emphasized that Smith was unarmed during the confrontation, that Johnson had retrieved weapons after police had separated the parties, and that Johnson's actions in striking Smith with the tire iron before shooting him indicated an escalation rather than protection. The sequence of weapons, first blunt force, then firearm, suggested an intent beyond merely stopping an immediate threat. After deliberations, the jury returned with a mixed verdict. They acquitted Johnson of malice murder, the most serious charge which would have indicated premeditated intent to kill. However, they found her guilty of voluntary manslaughter, aggravated assault, and cruelty to children. The verdict reflected the jury's conclusion that while Johnson may not have planned to kill Smith before that day, her actions exceeded legitimate self-defense. The sentencing phase brought further nuance to the case. The judge imposed a total sentence of 20 years, 5 years of incarceration, followed by 5 years of house arrest, and culminating in 10 years of probation. This structured sentence acknowledged both the severity of taking a human life and the complex circumstances surrounding the case. In explaining the sentence, the judge noted both aggravating and mitigating factors. While the court acknowledges the history of domestic tension in this relationship, the judge stated, the evidence clearly shows actions that went beyond what Georgia law permits for self-defense. The sentence prompted divided reactions from those connected to the case. Smith's family expressed frustration at what they viewed as insufficient consequences for taking their loved one's life. Several family members provided victim impact statements, describing Smith as a father who, despite his flaws, did not deserve his fate. He was trying to make a new start. One relative testified, now his children will grow up without him. Meanwhile, supporters of Johnson argued that the sentence failed to adequately account for the systemic failures that left her vulnerable despite repeated requests for protection. They pointed to her multiple calls to authorities as evidence of a person seeking help through proper channels before resorting to violence. Johnson's attorney filed an appeal shortly after sentencing, citing several grounds for review. The appeal contended that the court had not properly considered evidence regarding the history of abuse and alleged procedural missteps during the trial. During this appeals process, Johnson was permitted to remain under house arrest rather than beginning immediate incarceration, a decision that generated additional controversy. The case quickly became emblematic of broader debates about domestic violence intervention, self-defense claims, and the adequacy of protective systems for those in volatile relationships. The Quenisha Johnson case exposed fundamental flaws in how authorities respond to domestic disputes. When officers allowed Johnson and Smith to re-enter the home together after she had explicitly requested protection, they unwittingly set the stage for violence. This decision has prompted intense scrutiny of police protocols in domestic situations. The mechanisms designed to mitigate risk were inoperative or insufficient, noted one advocate during community forums following the trial. Despite Johnson's multiple calls to 911 and her request for an escort, the protective measures failed at their most critical moment. Law enforcement training has come under particular examination. Many experts argue that allowing both parties in a volatile domestic situation to return to a private space represents a dangerous miscalculation of risk. Police departments across Georgia have since reviewed their domestic violence response procedures, with some implementing enhanced training specifically addressing scenario assessment. Community leaders have called for concrete reforms, improved officer training in conflict de-escalation, more robust risk assessment tools, and stronger coordination between police and domestic violence support services. These proposals aim to close the gaps that allowed a preventable tragedy to occur, despite multiple warning signals. Beyond the courtroom and policy debates, those who knew DeMonte Smith worked to preserve his memory as more than just a victim. Family members speak of a father who, despite personal struggles, cared deeply for his children. They emphasize that his life held value and purpose beyond the circumstances of his death. This case reminds us that justice isn't just about verdicts, it's about prevention. At Truly Criminal Network, we believe examining these failures can save lives. If you found this analysis valuable, subscribe now and join our community working to understand how these tragedies happen and how they can be prevented. Next week on Truly Criminal Network, Vanished Without Ransom. The baffling case of a tech executive who disappeared from his lakeside home while his security system recorded no intruders.